Paula Patterson was standing under a crystal chandelier in a $5 million Manhattan ballroom when she heard her husband laugh about her miscarriage like it was an inconvenience. Kyle had one arm around Sabrina Cole's waist, whiskey loose in his hand, arrogance glowing in his smile. Paula, he scoffed to a group of investors. She's too broken to fight back. Honestly, at this point, she's just grateful I stayed. The men laughed. Paula felt every sound in the room disappear. 4 years of grief. 4 years of being called unstable, difficult, emotional, weak. And suddenly, she understood something terrifying. Kyle thought her silence meant defeat. What he never realized was that silence had been giving her time. Time to heal. Time to learn. Time to destroy him carefully. If someone has ever mistaken your kindness for weakness, stay with this story, because sometimes the quietest woman in the room is the one planning the ending. The Patterson house looked like something out of an architectural magazine. White stone exterior, floor-to-ceiling windows, a circular driveway lined with imported olive trees that somehow survived Connecticut winters because Kyle insisted on hiring a landscaping company from Manhattan. Everything about the property screamed wealth without ever raising its voice. People envied Paula Patterson constantly. At charity events, women touched her arm and whispered, "You're so lucky." Lucky. Paula used to smile when she heard it. By the end, she only nodded because explaining the truth would have taken too much energy. The truth was that loneliness sounded louder in large houses, especially at night. Especially when your husband stopped looking at you like a person. Paula stood barefoot in the kitchen one cold October morning, staring at the untouched cup of coffee Kyle had abandoned beside the marble island. The house was silent except for the ticking clock above the wine cabinet. Kyle hadn't come home until almost 2 in the morning. No explanation, no apology, just the smell of expensive cologne that didn't belong to him. Or maybe it did now. Paula wrapped her cardigan tighter around herself and opened the refrigerator mechanically. Yogurt, fruit, sparkling water. The kind of refrigerator rich people had when nobody actually cooked anymore. Her phone buzzed. A text from Kyle. "Dinner with investors tonight. Don't wait up. No heart. No love you. Nothing." Paula stared at the message longer than she should have. 4 years ago, she would have confronted him immediately. Now she simply muted the notification and placed the phone face down. That scared her more than the cheating, the numbness. Because numbness meant something inside her had started dying quietly. She remembered when Kyle used to kiss her forehead in the mornings while she worked beside him at the tiny dining table in their first apartment. Back when he was still building his company and she was the one helping him design investor decks at 2 in the morning, back when they were a team, before money changed the temperature of his soul, before he learned how powerful it felt to control people. Especially her. You should quit. That was how it started. Simple, casual, reasonable. Kyle had said it while loosening his tie one evening, barely looking up from his laptop. "You're exhausted all the time, Paula. My income is enough now. Why are you killing yourself working 80 hours a week?" At the time, it had sounded loving, supportive. So Paula left her branding career. Then came the smaller things. "You don't need to stress about finances anymore. I'll handle everything. You should spend more time at home. You've changed. You're always anxious lately. You're too emotional." Every sentence came wrapped in concern. That was what made it dangerous. Kyle never screamed in the beginning. He edited her slowly. Like a sculptor carving away pieces nobody noticed disappearing until the statue no longer looked familiar. By the time Paula realized she had become financially dependent on him, isolated from most of her friends, and terrified of disappointing him, Kyle already controlled the emotional climate of the entire house. If he was cold, the house felt cold. If he was irritated, everyone walked carefully. If he ignored her for days, Paula blamed herself. That was the sickest part. She always blamed herself first. The miscarriage destroyed whatever remained of her old identity. Paula still remembered the hospital lights, the unbearable emptiness afterward, the silence in the car ride home. She had stared out the passenger window while Kyle drove through rain-slick streets without touching her once. Not once. That was the moment she should have understood everything. But grief makes women forgive things that healthy versions of themselves would never tolerate. For months afterward, Paula barely slept. She cried in bathrooms so Kyle wouldn't hear. She stopped answering calls from friends because pretending to be okay became exhausting. And Kyle became irritated by sadness the way some people get irritated by background noise. "You can't stay stuck like this forever," he told her one night. Paula sat curled into the corner of their bed, clutching a heating pad against her stomach. "I lost our baby." Kyle exhaled sharply. "And I lost something too, Paula." Her voice cracked. "Then why does it feel like I'm grieving alone?" Kyle looked at her for a long moment before saying something that permanently altered the way she saw him. "Because I can't fall apart every time life gets difficult. Not cruel, not loud. Just cold enough to make her feel ashamed for hurting." That became his specialty, making pain feel embarrassing. Weeks later, he started sleeping in the guest room because work stress was affecting his sleep. Then came the late meetings, the hidden phone screen, the sudden gym obsession, the expensive new watches, the emotional distance that spread through the marriage like smoke under a door. Paula knew. Women always knew long before they admitted it aloud. But knowing and surviving were different things. So she kept trying harder. Cooking his favorite meals, planning anniversary dinners, buying lingerie she didn't even feel beautiful wearing anymore. Kyle barely noticed any of it, and when he did, it almost felt worse. "You're trying too hard lately," he said once with a smirk, as if loving her husband was pathetic. Paula looked at herself in the bathroom mirror later that night and barely recognized the woman staring back. Her eyes looked tired all the time now, careful, like someone permanently bracing for emotional impact. The final crack came on a snowy Thursday afternoon. Kyle was in Chicago for a conference. Paula had been searching through old insurance paperwork because the hospital kept sending duplicate bills from the miscarriage complications. She sat cross-legged on the office floor, surrounded by folders when she found the charge. A luxury hotel reservation, same week she was hospitalized, 2 guests, champagne service. Her stomach dropped instantly. At first she tried to rationalize it. Business meeting, corporate event, anything. Then she saw the second document attached behind it. A receipt. Sabrina Cole. Paula stopped breathing. The room tilted slightly around her. Not because the affair existed. Deep down, she had already known, but because of the dates. While she was bleeding in a hospital bed, Kyle had been in a hotel suite with another woman. Paula covered her mouth violently as nausea climbed her throat. The memory hit her all at once. Her crying in sterile hospital sheets. Kyle checking his phone constantly. Kyle stepping outside for work calls. Kyle acting annoyed when she begged him not to leave early. It had already started then. Maybe before then. Maybe while she was still carrying their child. Paula sat frozen on the hardwood floor for almost an hour. Then slowly, something strange happened. She stopped crying. Not because it hurt less, because something inside her had gone terrifyingly still. She looked down at the receipt again, then toward the massive, beautiful house she had sacrificed her entire identity to preserve. And for the first time in years, Paula Patterson felt anger louder than grief. The first thing Paula did after discovering the hotel receipt was memorize Sabrina Cole's face. Not intentionally. It just happened. Once your heart breaks hard enough, your brain becomes cruelly efficient at collecting evidence. Suddenly, Sabrina was everywhere. In tagged company photos, in blurred backgrounds of corporate event pictures, in Kyle's office, Christmas party from 2 years ago where Sabrina stood slightly too close beside him, smiling like she already knew something Paula didn't. 30 seconds into scrolling, Paula realized something even worse than the affair itself. It hadn't been reckless. It had been careful, long-term, calculated. Kyle hadn't stumbled into betrayal. He had built a second relationship piece by piece while coming home every night pretending to still be a husband. Paula sat alone in the dim light of the home office laptop, glowing against her exhausted face. Snow drifted softly outside the giant windows, making the entire house feel quieter somehow, like even the walls were listening. She clicked another photo. Sabrina in a black dress at a fundraising gala. Kyle's hand resting low against Sabrina's back. Not inappropriate enough for strangers to notice, but intimate enough for a wife to feel physically sick. Paula closed the laptop immediately. Her chest tightened so violently she thought she might throw up. Instead, she pressed both palms against her mouth and forced herself not to make a sound. That had become instinct too. Don't disturb Kyle, don't create tension, don't be difficult. The thought made her suddenly furious. She was sitting alone in a freezing office trying to cry quietly over her husband's affair inside a house partially paid for with her inheritance. And somehow she's still worried about inconveniencing him. The self-betrayal of that realization nearly hurt more than the cheating. Kyle came home the next evening carrying expensive takeout and acting strangely cheerful. "Hey," he called casually while setting his keys down. "I brought sushi from that place you like." Paula stood at the kitchen counter cutting lemons she had no intention of using. The normalcy of his voice made her dizzy. How could someone lie this smoothly? How could someone look directly at a grieving woman and still protect themselves first every single time? "You okay?" Kyle asked. She looked up slowly. His face was handsome in that polished, corporate American way that made people trust him immediately. Dark coat, perfect hair, relaxed smile. A stranger would have thought he was a good husband. That thought almost made Paula laugh. "I'm fine," she said quietly. Kyle studied her another second before nodding. "Good. You seemed weird lately. Weird. Not devastated. Not lonely. Not drowning. Weird." Paula resumed slicing lemons carefully because she suddenly imagined pressing the knife into the marble countertop hard enough to crack it. Instead, she asked softly, "How was Chicago long?" "Lie. Successful very. Lie. Did you miss me?" That question slipped out before she could stop it. Kyle paused. Only for a second, but Paula noticed. "I'm here, aren't I?" The answer landed like ice water. Not yes, not of course, just obligation disguised as presence. Kyle loosened his tie and moved toward the wine fridge. "You know," he said casually, "you should really start getting out more again. Staying in the house all day isn't helping your mental state." There it was again. The subtle rewriting of reality. Paula isolated because Kyle had slowly separated her from her entire life. Yet somehow the loneliness became evidence that something was wrong with her. She turned around slowly. My mental state. Kyle sighed immediately like she was exhausting already. "Please don't do this tonight. Do what turned everything into conflict." Paula stared at him in disbelief. He had cheated on her while she was hospitalized after losing their child, and somehow she still felt like the guilty one for asking questions he didn't even know she knew. Kyle poured himself wine. "You've changed since the miscarriage," he said quietly. That word still cut through her chest every time. "Miscarriage?" like a medical term could summarize the destruction of an entire future. Paula swallowed hard. People usually change after losing a baby. Kyle leaned against the counter. I lost something too, Paula. You lost interest, she whispered. His jaw tightened instantly. You see, this is exactly what I mean. Everything becomes emotional with you now. Paula felt something crack inside her. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough. Enough to finally see him clearly. Kyle didn't just avoid pain, he resented hers, because her grief required empathy he didn't want to give. And once Paula stopped being easy, he began treating her like a burden instead of a wife. That night, she waited until Kyle fell asleep before opening his laptop. Her hands shook so badly she almost typed the password wrong, but Kyle's passwords had always been predictable. Achievements, ego, dates important to him. Never her birthday anymore. The inbox opened instantly. Paula searched Sabrina's name, hundreds of emails, some professional, many not. The oldest one dated back almost 5 months before the miscarriage. Paula stopped breathing. 5 months. That meant Kyle had started sleeping with Sabrina while Paula was still pregnant, while he kissed her stomach at night, while they discussed baby names, while he promised they were happy. A sound escaped her throat before she could stop it. Tiny. Broken. Paula covered her mouth immediately and glanced toward the bedroom door. Kyle didn't stir. Of course he didn't. He slept peacefully these days. Only one person had been carrying the marriage on her nervous system. She continued scrolling numbly. Then she found the messages. Kyle to Sabrina. She's emotionally exhausting lately. She cries constantly. I feel trapped in that house. She's fragile. You have no idea. Paula stared at the screen until the words blurred. Fragile. That was the word Kyle used now whenever women became inconvenient. Not grieving, not hurting, fragile. A way to shrink real pain into weakness. Then came the message that nearly destroyed her completely. Sabrina, why don't you just leave her? Kyle's response arrived 2 minutes later. Because I need to secure a few more things first. Paula's blood went cold. A few more things. Assets, money, investments, her inheritance. The room suddenly felt too small to breathe inside. She kept reading. Kyle, once the restructuring is done, I'm filing. Paula shut the laptop instantly. Her entire body trembled violently now. Not from sadness anymore. From humiliation. This whole time she had been trying to save a marriage, while Kyle calculated the most profitable exit strategy. The betrayal was no longer emotional. It was strategic. Predatory. She stumbled into the garage because it was the only place in the house where she could completely fall apart without being heard. The cold air hit her immediately. Paula leaned against Kyle's black Mercedes and slid slowly to the concrete floor. Then finally, she cried. Not elegantly, not quietly. Years of grief ripped out of her chest all at once. The baby, the loneliness, the gaslighting, the affair. The way she had disappeared piece by piece, trying to become lovable enough for a man incapable of valuing love. I wasn't hard to love, she whispered through sobs. The words echoed softly in the dark garage. For the first time in years, Paula understood something important. Kyle needed her broken, because confident women asked questions. Confident women left. Confident women exposed men like him. That was why he kept convincing her she was weak. It was easier to control someone apologizing for existing. Paula cried for almost an hour, then slowly. The tears stopped, not because the pain disappeared, because something underneath it had changed shape. She sat there breathing hard in the freezing dark mascara streaked down her face, hands trembling in her lap. And somewhere between heartbreak and rage, Paula Patterson stopped wanting Kyle to love her again. Now she wanted something else. The truth. The strange thing about emotional abuse was that nobody could point to a single bruise. From the outside, Paula Patterson still looked like a privileged woman living an enviable life. She wore designer coats, drove a luxury SUV, hosted elegant dinners beside a man Forbes magazine once called Connecticut's most promising young CEO. People saw the photos and assumed she was loved. What they never saw was how carefully Paula measured her breathing before Kyle walked into a room, how she rehearsed harmless versions of herself, how she apologized automatically now. Sorry for crying. Sorry for asking. Sorry for existing too loudly. 3 days after discovering the emails, Paula sat across from Kyle at breakfast while he scrolled through his phone. The winter sunlight pouring through the kitchen windows made everything look deceptively peaceful. Kyle barely looked up. "You forgot to send the charity RSVP." Paula blinked slowly. "I thought you said we weren't going." Kyle sighed immediately. "No, Paula. I said I might have a conflict. You never listen lately." The lie was so casual it almost impressed her. Before, Paula would have questioned herself instantly. Maybe I remembered wrong. Maybe I misunderstood. But now she saw the pattern clearly. Reality bent around Kyle constantly, not dramatically, just enough to keep her unstable. Paula stared at him quietly. Kyle finally looked up. "What nothing?" That answer irritated him more than confrontation ever used to. Kyle frowned slightly. "You've been acting strange." "Strange." Again. Never hurt, never betrayed, never grieving. Just difficult enough to become the problem. Paula lowered her eyes toward her coffee, because for the first time in years, she understood something crucial. Kyle enjoyed emotional reactions. Tears gave him control. Defensiveness gave him power. As long as Paula kept reacting emotionally, he could keep painting her as unstable. That morning, she made a decision that changed the course of her life. She stopped defending herself, not because Kyle was right, because she finally understood he didn't care about truth. He cared about dominance. And suddenly silence became strategy. The shift happened slowly after that. Paula stopped asking where he'd been, stopped questioning late-night meetings, stopped begging for affection that always came with humiliation attached. And Kyle noticed immediately. At first he seemed relieved, then confused, then strangely irritated. One evening he came home after midnight smelling like Sabrina's floral perfume again. Paula sat curled on the living room couch with a blanket over her legs and a book open in her lap. Kyle loosened his tie. "You're awake." "Mm-hmm." "That's it." Paula looked up calmly. Should there be more? Kyle stared at her for a second too long. Normally this would have become a fight. Normally she would have cried. Instead, she simply returned to her book. Kyle's jaw tightened slightly before he disappeared upstairs. Paula waited until she heard the shower running. Then she reached beneath the couch cushion and pulled out the burner phone she'd bought 2 days earlier. Her hands still shook sometimes while doing secretive things. Not because she was wrong, because Kyle had trained her to feel guilty for protecting herself. The burner phone contained photos now, bank statements, screenshots, copies of emails, hotel receipts, insurance documents, every lie carefully stored. At first, collecting evidence made Paula nauseous. It felt sneaky, cruel. But then she remembered Kyle kissing her forehead before leaving to sleep with another woman while she recovered from losing their child. And suddenly survival mattered more than guilt. Naomi Ellis was the first person who truly saw what had happened to her. They met for coffee in Manhattan after nearly 2 years without seeing each other properly. Naomi arrived wearing a camel coat and oversized sunglasses, still effortlessly stylish in the way only New York women seemed capable of being. The second she saw Paula, her expression changed. "Oh my God." Paula forced a smile. "Hi to you too." Naomi pulled her into a hug so fast Paula almost broke apart right there in the middle of the cafe. When they sat down, Naomi stared at her carefully. "You're so thin. I'm fine. Don't do that." Paula looked away immediately. Naomi reached across the table gently. "Paula, when did you start looking afraid all the time?" The question shattered something, because Paula hadn't realized it showed. But now that Naomi said it aloud, she understood. Fear had become her permanent facial expression, even when Kyle wasn't around. Paula laughed weakly, but tears instantly filled her eyes. "I don't know how this happened." Naomi's voice softened. "Then tell me." And for the first time, Paula did. Not all at once, not dramatically. The words came out slowly. The cheating, the gaslighting, the loneliness, the miscarriage. The way Kyle could make her feel insane during arguments until she apologized for things she didn't even do. Naomi listened without interrupting, and when Paula finally finished, exhausted and embarrassed and shaking slightly, Naomi whispered the one sentence nobody had ever said to her before. "Paula, this is abuse." Paula froze instantly. "No, Kyle's not violent. Abuse doesn't start with bruises." The words lodged directly into Paula's chest. Naomi leaned forward carefully. "A man doesn't have to hit you to erase you." Paula looked down at her untouched coffee because suddenly crying in public felt unavoidable. For years, Kyle had convinced her she was too sensitive, too emotional, too damaged after the miscarriage. But what if she wasn't unstable? What if she had simply been slowly psychologically dismantled by someone who needed her weak to feel powerful? The realization terrified her, because it meant she had wasted years trying to heal wounds someone kept reopening intentionally. Naomi found Dr. Ethan Miller for her 2 weeks later. Paula almost canceled the appointment 3 times. Kyle had spent years mocking therapy. "People who can't manage their own emotions pay strangers to pretend they're special," he once said. Still, Paula went. Dr. Miller's office overlooked the Hudson River. Warm lighting, soft gray furniture, no judgment in his eyes. That alone nearly made Paula cry. During the first session, she kept minimizing everything automatically. "Kyle just gets stressed. He didn't mean it like that. I think I'm difficult lately." Dr. Miller listened quietly before asking one question. "When was the last time you felt emotionally safe with your husband?" Paula opened her mouth, then closed it, because she genuinely couldn't remember. The silence answered for her. Weeks passed. Therapy became the only place Paula stopped pretending. Dr. Miller taught her words Kyle had carefully prevented her from learning. Gaslighting, coercive control, trauma response, emotional dependency. Each term felt like someone finally turning lights on inside a dark room. And with clarity came anger, healthy anger. The kind that sounded less like revenge and more like self-respect returning home. Then came Evelyn Brooks. Naomi referred her quietly. "Best divorce attorney in New York," she said. "Women hire her when they're done surviving." Paula met Evelyn in a private office overlooking downtown Manhattan. The woman radiated calm intelligence. Sharp navy suit, controlled posture, eyes that missed absolutely nothing. Evelyn reviewed Paula's documents silently for nearly 20 minutes. When she finally looked up, her expression had hardened. "He's been preparing financially for years." Paula swallowed painfully. "Can I even win against someone like him?" Evelyn leaned back slightly. "Yes." The answer came without hesitation, not comforting, not emotional, certain. Paula nearly broke down from hearing confidence directed toward her for the first time in years. But Evelyn continued carefully, not if you keep reacting emotionally in front of him. Paula frowned slightly. What do you mean? Evelyn folded her hands neatly. Men like your husband survive through narrative control. Right now he believes you're fragile, unstable, predictable. Paula's chest tightened, because that was exactly how Kyle described her. Evelyn's eyes locked onto hers. So stop correcting him. Silence filled the office. Then Evelyn said the sentence that would change Paula's entire life. If you want freedom, Paula, stop acting wounded in front of the man who created the wound. The first thing Paula Patterson rebuilt was not her confidence. It was her routine. Because Dr. Miller told her something during therapy that stayed in her head for weeks afterward. Trauma survives best inside chaos. So Paula started creating structure again. Small things at first. Wake up at 6. Drink water before coffee. Morning walks without her phone. 10 pages of reading before bed. It sounded insignificant compared to the destruction of her marriage, but after years of emotional instability, routine felt strangely revolutionary. Kyle barely noticed any of it, which was perfect. That became Paula's greatest advantage. Kyle only paid attention to her when she was emotional. The quieter and calmer she became, the more invisible she seemed to him. And invisible women learned everything. 4 months after meeting Evelyn Brooks, Paula sat inside a private financial literacy course in Manhattan wearing oversized glasses and a baseball cap like she was hiding from paparazzi instead of her own life. There were 12 people in the room. Most were younger men trying to understand investment structures. Paula was the only person taking handwritten notes with absolute desperation. Because every sentence felt like reclaiming a piece of herself Kyle had deliberately taken away. Corporate asset shielding, offshore transfers, marital financial concealment, shell corporations. The language terrified her at first. Then slowly, it empowered her. Kyle had spent years making financial conversations sound too complicated for her to understand. Now Paula realized confusion had been part of the strategy. A dependent woman was easier to trap, especially one grieving enough to stop questioning things. At home, she played her role carefully, soft-spoken, gentle, recovering. Kyle seemed almost relaxed lately, like a man who believed the difficult part was over. One night during dinner, he glanced at her over his wine glass. You seem calmer recently. Paula cut into her salmon carefully. Is that a bad thing? No, Kyle said. Honestly, it's nice. Nice. Meaning easier. Paula smiled faintly without responding. Inside, she felt something cold uncurl. Because Kyle truly believed emotional suffering had finally made her obedient. Meanwhile, Paula was quietly rebuilding herself in places he never looked. The gym became part of the transformation too, not because she wanted revenge body validation, because anger needed somewhere to go. At first, she could barely last 20 minutes on the treadmill before memories started flooding her chest. Kyle pulling away when she cried, the hotel receipt, the messages calling her exhausting. But eventually, physical exhaustion became relief. Every mile felt like reclaiming territory inside herself. One rainy afternoon after boxing class, Paula caught her reflection in the gym mirror and froze. Not because she suddenly looked glamorous, because she looked awake. For years, her eyes had carried permanent apology inside them. Now there was something else emerging, awareness. And awareness was dangerous, especially to men like Kyle. Naomi noticed it first. You're standing differently, she said during lunch one afternoon. Paula laughed softly. What does that even mean? It means you stopped shrinking. The sentence hit harder than expected, because Naomi was right. Paula used to physically make herself smaller around Kyle. Quieter voice, smaller opinions, careful movements. As if taking up less emotional space could prevent conflict, now she was beginning to understand something horrifying. No amount of shrinking would have ever made Kyle kinder. Cruel people didn't stop once you became easier to hurt. They simply hurt you more comfortably. The freelance consulting started almost accidentally. An old contact from Paula's branding career reached out after seeing one of her anonymous strategy articles online. "I know this is random," the woman said over Zoom, "but are you the Paula Patterson who used to work at Greenline Media?" Paula hesitated. "Used to? Well, you were kind of legendary there." Legendary. The word nearly made her emotional. Kyle had spent years rewriting her identity until even Paula forgot who she used to be. Now strangers remembered her brilliance more clearly than her own husband did. The consulting project lasted 3 weeks. Then another client came, then another. Paula opened a private business account under her maiden name. For the first time in years, money entered her life that Kyle didn't control. The freedom of that almost scared her. Not because independence felt wrong, because she realized how intentionally Kyle had removed it before. One evening, Kyle walked into his home office to find Paula reading financial reports on her tablet. He frowned immediately. "What's that?" Paula looked up calmly. "Investment research." Kyle gave a short laugh. "Since when are you interested in investments?" The condescension came so naturally, now he probably didn't even hear it. Paula smiled lightly. People can learn new things. Kyle loosened his cufflinks while watching her carefully. "You don't need to stress yourself out with that stuff. It's complicated." There it was again, the old strategy: confuse her, dismiss her, protect the imbalance. Except now, Paula recognized it instantly. She tilted her head slightly. "You manage it. It can't be impossible." Kyle's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. For a second she saw irritation, not because she challenged him aggressively, because she sounded confident, and confidence disrupted control. That night, Paula added another observation to her hidden notes file: "Kyle becomes uncomfortable when I appear capable." Patterns mattered. Evelyn taught her that. Abusive people repeated themselves constantly because control depended on repetition. The real breakthrough came 8 months later. Paula sat in Evelyn's office reviewing corporate records when she noticed something strange on a scanned investment document. Her stomach tightened instantly. "Kyle signed this for me." Evelyn adjusted her glasses. "Are you certain?" Paula nodded slowly. "That's supposed to be my signature." Silence. Evelyn leaned closer toward the document. Then her entire demeanor sharpened. "Paula, this is forgery." The word seemed too criminal to belong to her life. Forgery happened in movies, in scandals, not inside beautiful houses with curated dinner parties and luxury vacations. Evelyn's eyes lifted carefully toward hers. "Did you authorize this transfer how much?" Paula looked at the number again. Her inheritance trust had partially funded a hidden corporate restructuring Kyle never told her about. The amount made her dizzy. Oh my God. Evelyn sat back slowly. "This changes everything." Paula stared down at the forged signature. Kyle's handwriting was good, convincing, confident, like he genuinely believed he had the right to become her whenever necessary. And suddenly, Paula understood the full truth of her marriage. Kyle never viewed her as an equal partner. She was an asset, a resource, a carefully managed emotional support system designed to strengthen his life while weakening her own. The realization should have broken her. Instead, she smiled, not happily, not cruelly, but with the terrifying calm of someone finally seeing the battlefield clearly. Evelyn noticed immediately. What Paula looked up slowly. For the first time, she whispered, "I'm not the one in danger anymore." Outside the office windows Manhattan glowed against the darkening sky. And somewhere across Connecticut, Kyle Patterson was probably pouring himself expensive whiskey, completely unaware that the woman he called broken had just found the evidence capable of destroying everything he built. Kyle Patterson's biggest mistake was believing healing looked soft. He expected recovery to look grateful, quiet, obedient. What he never anticipated was that a woman rebuilding herself in silence could become terrifyingly observant. By the third year of Paula's transformation, Kyle barely monitored her anymore. That alone told her everything. Men only obsessively control women they still consider unpredictable. Kyle thought he had already won, which made him careless. And careless, powerful men left fingerprints everywhere. Are you even listening? Kyle's voice snapped across the dining room sharply. Paula looked up from her plate calmly. Kyle leaned back in his chair with visible irritation. I asked if you confirmed the Hamptons reservation for August. I did. Then why didn't you answer? Paula folded her napkin carefully beside her wine glass. Because you didn't give me time to. A small silence followed. Not dramatic, but noticeable. Kyle stared at her with narrowed eyes like he was trying to figure out when her energy had changed. Paula noticed he did that more lately, watching her longer, studying her reactions, not because he suspected the truth yet, because emotionally manipulative people became uncomfortable when their usual methods stopped working, and Paula no longer reacted the way she used to. No tears, no defensive explanations, no emotional spirals, just stillness. The stillness unsettled him. Kyle scoffed lightly and reached for his bourbon. You've gotten cold lately. Paula almost smiled at that. Cold. Interesting word. Because when Kyle withdrew affection for years, it was called stress. When Paula stopped begging for emotional scraps, suddenly it became cruelty. She tilted her head slightly. Maybe I'm just tired. Kyle gave her a dismissive shrug and checked his phone again. Sabrina. Paula knew immediately. There was a specific expression Kyle wore while texting her. Subtle amusement. Vanity. The look of a man enjoying being desired. Paula returned to cutting her steak slowly. 3 years ago, this moment would have destroyed her entire evening. Now she simply cataloged it mentally. Emotional detachment had become survival, and survival made her sharper. Later that night, Paula stood in Kyle's walk-in closet pretending to organize dry cleaning while secretly photographing financial folders hidden inside his safe drawer. Kyle showered in the adjacent bathroom, humming faintly to himself. Comfortable, distracted, completely unaware. Paula moved quickly now, not nervously anymore, efficiently. Her burner phone contained hundreds of files at this point, offshore account transfers, corporate restructuring documents, hidden investments, messages, expense reports tied to Sabrina, forged signatures. Every month the case against Kyle expanded quietly. Every month Paula became less afraid. Dr. Miller once told her something during therapy that permanently changed her perspective. Fear disappears when your self-respect becomes more important than your attachment. At the time, Paula didn't fully understand it. Now she did. She no longer feared losing Kyle. She feared losing herself again. That changed everything. The body shaming started around the same time Kyle began feeling his control slipping subconsciously. You used to take better care of yourself, he said casually one morning while adjusting his cufflinks. Paula looked up from her coffee. I go to the gym 6 days a week. Kyle smirked slightly. I meant your energy. Translation, you no longer make me feel worshipped. Paula almost laughed. Instead, she simply said, people change. Kyle's jaw tightened faintly. Again, that look, that confusion. Like he couldn't figure out where the fragile version of her had gone. Because emotionally abusive people depended on predictability, and Paula had become unreadable. That terrified him more than anger ever could. Daniel Reeves entered the story quietly, like most dangerous things did. Paula met him officially dozens of times over the years at corporate dinners and holiday events. Kyle's CFO had always seemed reserved, polite, painfully professional, the kind of man who noticed everything and commented on nothing. But during one investor party in Manhattan, Paula caught Daniel watching Kyle carefully after Kyle humiliated her publicly over a harmless comment about market trends. You wouldn't understand the numbers, Kyle said with a short laugh in front of several executives. People chuckled awkwardly. Old Paula would have shrunk instantly. New Paula simply smiled. That's interesting, she said calmly. Considering I built your first 3 investor presentations. The table went silent. Kyle's smile disappeared for half a second. Daniel noticed. Paula noticed him noticing. That was the beginning. 2 weeks later, Daniel approached her privately after a charity luncheon. Mrs. Patterson. Paula turned. Daniel hesitated slightly before lowering his voice. I hope this isn't inappropriate, but are you all right? The question nearly stunned her, not because it was intimate, because it was observant. Most people saw wealth and stopped looking deeper. Paula answered carefully. Why would you ask that? Daniel glanced away briefly. I've worked around powerful men a long time. His voice remained neutral. I know what fear looks like. The sentence sat heavily between them. Paula studied him cautiously. Why are you telling me this? Daniel exhaled slowly. Because I'm beginning to think there are things happening inside that company that aren't legal. Her pulse slowed instantly. Interesting. Very interesting. Paula kept her expression controlled. You should probably discuss that with Kyle. Daniel gave a humorless smile. That's exactly the problem. After that conversation, things accelerated quietly. Encrypted emails, short meetings, careful exchanges. Daniel never said too much directly, but he confirmed enough for Paula to understand the scale of Kyle's financial misconduct. And the deeper she looked, the uglier it became. Shell accounts, manipulated reporting, hidden transfers tied to overseas entities. Kyle wasn't just arrogant, he believed himself untouchable. One rainy Thursday evening, Daniel handed Paula a sealed envelope inside a crowded parking garage beneath a midtown restaurant. Neither of them spoke much. Paranoia lived in corporate scandals. Be careful, Daniel said quietly. Paula accepted the envelope carefully. Why help me? Daniel looked exhausted suddenly, because good people don't deserve what men like him do to them. Paula sat in her car for nearly 10 minutes before opening the file. Her stomach dropped instantly. Wire transfers, offshore movement records, corporate concealment trails, enough evidence to destroy not only Kyle's marriage, but potentially his entire empire. Her hands trembled slightly while flipping through the documents. Then she saw the final page. An internal authorization connected directly to forged spousal consent. Kyle had used her identity repeatedly, not once, multiple times. Paula leaned back slowly against the leather seat. Outside rain hammered the windshield in violent waves. For a moment she closed her eyes. Not from fear, from realization. Kyle never imagined she would survive him long enough to fight back. That had always been his fatal assumption. The broken wife, the grieving woman, the emotionally fragile shadow following him through charity galas and corporate dinners. He stopped watching her years ago, and because of that, Paula Patterson had finally become the most dangerous person in his life. Sabrina Cole used to think she was different. That was how Kyle kept women attached to him. He made each one feel chosen right before he started controlling them. For nearly 3 years, Sabrina believed she was the exception to Paula Patterson's tragedy. Kyle told her everything carefully. Paula was unstable, fragile, emotionally draining. She stopped being a wife a long time ago, he once whispered against Sabrina's skin in a luxury hotel suite overlooking downtown Chicago. Back then, Sabrina believed him. Because Kyle was persuasive in the way narcissistic men often were, confident enough to make cruelty sound reasonable, and because Paula always looked so quiet in public, withdrawn, almost detached. Sabrina mistook survival for weakness until Kyle started treating her the same way. The first shift was subtle, ignored texts, canceled plans, coldness after emotional conversations. Then came the criticism. You're getting clingy lately. You overthink everything. You're too sensitive. Sabrina froze the first time he said those words. Too sensitive. Exactly how he described Paula. That was the moment fear entered the relationship for the first time. Not because Kyle yelled, because he sounded rehearsed, like he'd used those lines before. One Friday evening, Sabrina sat alone inside Kyle's Manhattan apartment, waiting nearly 2 hours for him to arrive. Rain streaked against the massive windows, while untouched pasta grew cold on the kitchen counter. When Kyle finally walked in, he barely looked at her. Jesus, why are all the lights off? Sabrina stood slowly. You said you'd be here at 7. Kyle tossed his keys down carelessly. I got busy. You stopped answering me. Kyle immediately sighed with exaggerated exhaustion. There you go. Sabrina frowned. What does that mean? It means every conversation turns into emotional punishment lately. The sentence hit her so hard she physically stepped back, because suddenly she saw it. The pattern. Kyle didn't respond to pain. He repositioned himself as the victim of it. Sabrina folded her arms tightly across her chest. I'm not punishing you for asking where you were. Kyle loosened his tie. I can't constantly manage your insecurity. Her insecurity. Not his disappearing acts, not the lies, not the emotional distance. Suddenly, Sabrina understood how Paula probably spent years questioning her own reality. Kyle walked to the kitchen and glanced at the untouched dinner. What is this I cooked? You know I don't eat carbs this late. Sabrina stared at him in disbelief. 3 years earlier, he would have kissed her for the effort alone. Now he looked annoyed. She expected appreciation, and for the first time, Sabrina felt something colder than heartbreak. Recognition. Later that night, while Kyle slept beside her, Sabrina lay awake staring at the ceiling. Paula's face kept appearing in her mind, not the polished version from charity galas, the quieter moments. The way Paula sometimes flinched slightly when Kyle interrupted her, the way she apologized constantly, the sadness in her eyes that Sabrina once mistook for weakness. Suddenly guilt wrapped around Sabrina's ribs so tightly she could barely breathe. Because maybe Paula hadn't been crazy at all. Maybe she had just been surviving him longer. 3 weeks later, Sabrina found herself sitting in her car outside a small cafe in Manhattan, staring through the glass window at Paula Patterson. She almost drove away 3 separate times. But guilt finally outweighed pride. Paula looked elegant in an understated cream sweater, reading something on her tablet, while soft jazz played through the cafe speakers, calm, composed, not remotely broken. That unsettled Sabrina more than rage would have. When Sabrina finally approached the table, Paula looked up immediately. No surprise crossed her face, almost like she'd been expecting this eventually. Can I sit down? Sabrina asked quietly. Paula studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. Sabrina sat carefully across from the woman whose life she helped destroy. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, Sabrina whispered, "I think he's lying to both of us." Paula's expression didn't change. "He lies to everyone." The calmness in her voice made Sabrina's throat tighten. No bitterness, no hysteria, just certainty. Sabrina looked down at her trembling hands. "I didn't know everything." "No," Paula said softly. "You only knew his version." Something about that nearly made Sabrina cry instantly, because Paula wasn't attacking her, and somehow that kindness hurt worse. "I thought you hated me." Paula leaned back slightly. "I did at first. The honesty stung. But then I realized something." Paula's eyes remained steady. "Women like us are easier to manipulate when we're fighting each other." Sabrina swallowed hard. Kyle always framed Paula like an obstacle, an unstable wife refusing to let go, but sitting across from her now felt deeply uncomfortable because Paula didn't resemble Kyle's stories at all. She resembled someone who had survived a war quietly. Sabrina finally whispered the question haunting her. "Was he always like this?" Paula looked out the cafe window briefly before answering. "No, the sadness in those 2 letters felt devastating. He becomes colder once he knows you love him enough to stay." Silence settled heavily between them. Sabrina's eyes burned suddenly. The emotional neglect, the manipulation, the way Kyle withdrew affection whenever she challenged him emotionally, it all made horrifying sense now. Paula stirred her coffee absent-mindedly. "What happened?" Sabrina laughed weakly through rising tears. "He said I was becoming emotionally exhausting." Paula closed her eyes briefly, like hearing her own history repeated out loud physically hurt. Then she looked at Sabrina again and quietly said the sentence that shattered whatever denial remained. "That's what he says when women stop obeying him." Sabrina started crying instantly, not dramatic sobbing, just silent tears sliding down her face because deep down she finally understood the truth. Kyle never loved vulnerability. He exploited it. And suddenly, she couldn't stop imagining Paula bleeding in a hospital bed while Kyle texted another woman about how difficult his wife had become. "Oh my God," Sabrina whispered brokenly. "I helped him hurt you." Paula's expression softened slightly. "No," she said quietly. Kyle was always going to hurt whoever loved him most. The compassion in that sentence almost destroyed Sabrina completely, because Paula had every reason to humiliate her. Instead, she offered understanding, and that made Kyle seem even uglier by comparison. Sabrina wiped her face shakily. "There's more you don't know." Paula became very still. "What do you..." Sabrina hesitated. Fear crossed her face for the first time. "Kyle started moving money recently. Private accounts. I accidentally saw emails." Paula's pulse slowed immediately. "Interesting. Very interesting." Sabrina reached into her designer handbag with trembling fingers and pulled out a small black USB drive. "I copied everything I could before he noticed." Paula stared at it silently. This was dangerous now. Not emotional, not personal. Dangerous. Sabrina placed the USB carefully onto the table between them. Then she whispered the words that finally changed the entire war. "He's hiding something bigger than the affair." Paula looked down at the drive for several seconds. Then slowly, she picked it up. Margaret Patterson believed appearances mattered more than truth. That was why she scheduled the dinner only 3 days after rumors about Kyle's financial instability began quietly circulating among investors. Not because she cared about Paula, because the Patterson family protected the brand before the people inside it. The invitation arrived through text. "Family dinner Sunday. Formal. We need to discuss important matters. No warmth, no affection. Just business disguised as family. Paula stared at the message while standing in her Manhattan apartment kitchen. Evelyn read over her shoulder calmly. "This is pressure," the attorney said. "I know. They're nervous." Paula looked down at the phone again. Good. For years she had been the only frightened person in the marriage. Now fear was beginning to spread. Sunday night arrived cold and gray. The Patterson estate glowed warmly against the Connecticut snow, like a luxury advertisement for old American money. Paula stepped from the car wearing a black cashmere coat and diamond earrings Kyle once bought after forgetting their anniversary. Back then, she mistook expensive gifts for remorse. Now she understood they were simply distractions with price tags. The butler opened the door immediately. Margaret Patterson stood in the foyer, already dressed for war. Elegant pearl necklace, perfect blonde bob, the expression of a woman who weaponized politeness professionally. "Paula," Margaret said with air-kiss formality, "you look tired." Translation, "You look weak." Paula smiled faintly. "You look observant." For a brief second, surprise crossed Margaret's face. Tiny, but noticeable. Good. The dining room looked exactly the same as it had for years. Long mahogany table, crystal glasses, old family portraits watching from gold frames, a room built for power conversations. Kyle stood beside the fireplace pouring bourbon when Paula entered. The second his eyes landed on her, something shifted subtly in his expression. Suspicion, not full awareness yet, but instinct. Like some part of him finally sensed movement beneath the surface. "You made it," he said carefully. Paula removed her gloves slowly. "You invited me." Kyle watched her a second too long. Then Richard Patterson entered with the heavy, confident footsteps of a man accustomed to controlling rooms. "Let's sit," he said briskly. No one mentioned love. No one asked how Paula was doing. That alone said everything about the family she married into. Dinner began with artificial normalcy. Steak, wine, corporate conversation, Margaret discussing charity boards, Richard complaining about market volatility, Kyle checking his phone every few minutes. Sabrina was gone now. Paula knew that bothered him more than he admitted aloud. Eventually, Richard set his fork down heavily. "We should discuss restructuring." There it was. Straight to business. Kyle leaned back casually like this conversation meant nothing. "We're updating some company protections considering the current market." Protections. Interesting word for asset concealment. Margaret offered Paula a tight smile. "It's mostly procedural, dear." Dear. Another weapon disguised as affection? A leather folder appeared beside Kyle's plate. Paula recognized the strategy immediately. Pressure her at dinner. Surround her emotionally. Make her sign before she fully processes anything. Old Paula would have panicked instantly. New Paula reached for her wine calmly instead. Kyle slid the folder toward her. "We just need signatures tonight." Paula opened the documents carefully. Corporate liability separation, asset restructuring, spousal acknowledgement clauses. Translation. Kyle was trying to protect himself before the scandal exploded publicly. Her pulse remained perfectly steady. "Seems urgent," she said lightly. Richard answered first. "These things are time sensitive." Paula glanced up slowly. So the company is in trouble. The silence afterward felt surgical. Margaret recovered first. "Don't be dramatic." Paula almost smiled. Interesting. Women expressing observations always became drama in this family. Kyle leaned forward slightly. "It's precautionary, and my inheritance is involved again." Kyle's jaw tightened instantly. "Paula, no." She interrupted softly. "I'm asking." The room shifted. Not because she raised her voice, because she interrupted his control publicly. Richard exhaled sharply. The company survived difficult years because family pulled together. There. Accidental truth. Paula looked directly at him. My money. Richard realized the mistake too late. Margaret immediately jumped in. You benefited from this lifestyle too, Paula. The sentence hit with familiar cruelty, as if emotional suffering should feel acceptable inside beautiful houses. Paula closed the folder slowly. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. What Paula met her gaze calmly. I'm trying to remember the last time anyone at this table cared whether I was happy. Silence. Kyle laughed once under his breath. There it is. Paula turned toward him. There what is, this emotional performance. Performance. God, he really needed women's pain to feel theatrical in order to dismiss it. Margaret dabbed her lips delicately with a napkin. Paula, after the miscarriage, things became difficult. Difficult. Not devastating, not traumatic, just inconvenient for everyone else. Paula felt heat rise slowly into her chest. Not unstable heat. Righteous heat. Margaret continued carefully. Kyle has been incredibly patient with you. Patient. The word nearly made Paula laugh aloud. Patient while cheating. Patient while gaslighting. Patient while slowly dismantling her confidence until she apologized for breathing too loudly in her own house. Kyle rubbed his temple dramatically. Can we not do this tonight? Paula stared at him. You mean acknowledge reality? I mean stop making everything about your feelings. And there it was. The sentence that finally revealed everything. To Kyle, emotions only mattered when they belonged to him. His stress, his pressure, his reputation. Her pain simply interrupted the narrative. Richard leaned forward impatiently. Paula signed the documents, not a request, an order. Paula looked down at the papers again, then slowly back up. No. The word landed heavily. Margaret blinked first. Kyle's entire posture stiffened. What Paula's voice remained terrifyingly calm. I said no. Kyle stared at her like she'd suddenly started speaking another language, because in a way she had. Boundaries were foreign inside emotionally abusive relationships. Margaret's expression hardened immediately. You're being selfish. Paula looked directly at her mother-in-law. I almost died grieving alone in this family. Margaret rolled her eyes slightly. Oh, please. That tiny gesture changed everything, because suddenly Paula understood something horrifying. These people genuinely believed her suffering was excessive, embarrassing, inconvenient. Kyle leaned back with visible irritation now. You wouldn't survive 1 year without me. Silence. The sentence echoed through the dining room coldly. Richard looked uncomfortable. Margaret looked approving. And Paula? Paula felt something inside her settle permanently, because there it was, the truth. Kyle didn't love her. He loved dependency, loved knowing she needed him, loved believing he could emotionally starve her forever without consequences. What none of them realized was that Paula's phone sat silently recording inside her handbag beside the table. Every insult, every coercive statement, every accidental confession. Years ago, she would have defended herself desperately. Tonight, she simply collected evidence. Kyle noticed her expression eventually. What Paula smiled faintly. For the first time in years, the smile reached her eyes, and somehow that seemed to unsettle him more than tears ever had. Nothing, she said softly. I'm just listening carefully now. The rest of dinner collapsed after that. Tension spread everywhere. Margaret became colder. Richard increasingly irritated. Kyle visibly distracted. But Paula remained calm all the way until she walked out of the house into the freezing Connecticut night. Inside her car, she finally exhaled slowly, then reached into her handbag. She replayed the recording briefly. Kyle's voice filled the dark car interior. "She'd never survive without me." Paula stared through the windshield for several seconds. Then she saved the file carefully into a digital folder already filled with years of evidence. The folder name read only 2 words: "Final Stage." The strange thing about revenge was that the fantasy felt louder than the reality. For years, Paula Patterson imagined screaming at Kyle, throwing glasses against walls, exposing him publicly during one of his polished corporate speeches. But real power, she discovered, was much quieter than rage. Real power looked like preparation, and preparation required patience. By spring, Evelyn Brooks had converted an entire conference room into what Naomi jokingly called the war headquarters. Folders covered the long oak table. Financial timelines, bank records, wire transfers, screenshots, legal strategy notes. Every lie Kyle Patterson ever told had slowly become paperwork. Paula stood near the window overlooking downtown Manhattan, while Evelyn reviewed documents beside Daniel Reeves. Rain pressed softly against the glass outside. Inside the room, tension vibrated like static electricity. Daniel adjusted his glasses uneasily. "If this goes public," he said carefully, "the board will panic." Evelyn didn't look up. They should. Paula remained silent. Months ago, conversations like this would have terrified her. Now she felt oddly detached. Not cold, focused. Dr. Miller once explained that healing sometimes looked less like becoming softer and more like becoming impossible to manipulate. Paula understood that now. Kyle still thought this was salvageable. That was his weakness. He believed love would always keep her emotionally trapped long enough for him to regain control. Meanwhile, Paula had quietly evolved into someone he no longer understood. Evelyn slid another file across the table. These offshore transfers alone could trigger federal investigation. Daniel rubbed his jaw nervously. "He'll blame accounting." Paula spoke calmly for the first time in 20 minutes. "No, he'll blame me first." Silence followed, because everyone in the room knew she was right. Kyle's survival instinct always required a villain, and for years Paula had played the role perfectly: the unstable wife, the grieving woman, the emotional burden. Only now the narrative was collapsing, and Kyle could feel it. That was becoming increasingly obvious. 2 nights later, Paula walked into a charity fundraiser at the Four Seasons beside Kyle for the first time in months. The ballroom glittered with money and reputation, women in silk gowns, men discussing investments over bourbon. The kind of room where powerful people performed happiness professionally. Kyle rested one hand against Paula's lower back while greeting donors. Possessive, polished. Anyone watching would have assumed they were still a successful couple. That almost made Paula smile. Kyle leaned closer while cameras flashed nearby. "You've been very quiet lately." Paula kept her expression serene. "Maybe I finally learned." Kyle studied her profile carefully. Something in his face had changed over recent weeks. Not guilt, suspicion. Like his instincts kept warning him something was wrong, even while his ego insisted he remained in control. "You look different," he said. Paula turned toward him slowly. "Different how?" Kyle hesitated, more confident. There it was, the thing he hated most. Not anger, not confrontation, confidence. Because confidence meant independence. And independent women eventually walked away. Paula gave him a small smile. "I forgot I was allowed to exist outside your version of me." Kyle's expression darkened immediately. "That's not fair." "Interesting." Men like Kyle always called honesty unfair once it threatened their self-image. Before Paula could answer, a blonde woman from one of the investment firms approached them excitedly. "Paula, oh my God!" Paula blinked in surprise. "Lindsay, look at you." Lindsay laughed warmly. "I heard you've started consulting again." Kyle's posture changed instantly beside her. Tiny shift, tension. Paula noticed everything now. Lindsay continued enthusiastically. "Your old branding work is still legendary in some circles." There was that word again. Legendary. Every time someone praised the woman Paula used to be, Kyle looked subtly irritated, as if reminders of her competence disrupted the fragile hierarchy he built between them. Kyle smiled tightly. "She's just doing little projects." Little projects. Paula glanced sideways toward him. Interesting. Even now he needed to minimize her publicly. Lindsay frowned slightly. "Actually, one of my partners said Paula's campaign strategy saved an entire product launch years ago." Kyle took a sip of bourbon. "Well, people exaggerate." Paula felt it then. Not pain. Clarity. Kyle genuinely could not tolerate environments where she was respected independently from him. That realization no longer wounded her. It freed her. Later that evening, while Kyle entertained investors near the ballroom bar, Paula slipped quietly into the marble restroom and locked herself inside a stall. Her burner phone buzzed instantly. Evelyn! One of the shell accounts moved money again tonight. Paula's pulse slowed. How much enough to prove intent? Outside the stall, women laughed near the mirrors while fixing lipstick under expensive lighting. Inside, Paula listened carefully as Evelyn continued outlining the next phase. "We're almost ready." Almost. The words made her stomach tighten. Because once this began publicly, there would be no return to the illusion of marriage. No more pretending, no more surviving quietly. Kyle would become dangerous when cornered. Paula knew that better than anyone. "You still there?" Evelyn asked. "Yes." You afraid Paula thought about it honestly, then surprised herself with the answer. "No." And she wasn't. Not anymore. The woman Kyle psychologically controlled for years would have been terrified of losing him. But Paula already mourned that marriage long ago. Now she only feared wasting the rest of her life pretending abuse was love. By early summer, the pressure around Kyle intensified. Investors grew nervous. Board members started asking harder questions. Sabrina officially ended all contact after submitting additional documentation through Evelyn. And Kyle began unraveling, subtly at first. More drinking, shorter temper, paranoia disguised as irritation. One night he cornered Paula in the kitchen after midnight. "Did you talk to Daniel recently?" Paula looked up from her tea calmly. Why, Kyle's eyes narrowed. He's acting strange. Interesting. Very interesting. Paula shrugged lightly. Maybe he's stressed. Kyle stared at her hard. "You know it's weird." "What is?" "You stopped asking questions." Paula held his gaze evenly. "And now you miss it." The silence stretched dangerously. Kyle stepped closer. For a brief second, Paula saw the real emotion underneath everything else. Fear. Not fear of losing her, fear of losing control over her. "You think I don't notice things changing?" he asked quietly. Paula's heartbeat remained perfectly steady. "Things have been changing for years, Kyle." His jaw tightened. "You're talking differently lately." "No," Paula said softly. "I'm just finally saying what I mean." That unsettled him visibly, because emotional manipulators depended on confusion, and Paula no longer sounded confused. She sounded certain. Kyle ran one hand through his hair aggressively. "If you're angry about something, just say it." The irony nearly made her laugh. After years of punishment every time she expressed pain, suddenly he wanted communication now that silence threatened him. Paula took a slow sip of tea. "You spent a long time teaching me not to tell you the truth." Kyle looked genuinely stunned by the sentence. Good. He should hear himself in it. Then suddenly his phone buzzed. Kyle glanced down, and Paula saw it instantly. Panic, fast, sharp, gone almost immediately afterward, but not fast enough. Kyle looked back at her too carefully now. What? Paula smiled faintly. Nothing. Kyle didn't believe her. For the first time in their marriage, he looked at Paula Patterson like she might actually be dangerous. And somewhere deep inside him, instinct finally whispered the truth. The woman he stopped watching years ago had been quietly building the fall of his entire world. Kyle Patterson loved boardrooms because they were the only places where nobody ever interrupted him. Power followed him naturally there. People laughed harder at his jokes, listened carefully when he spoke, admired him for the same cold ambition that destroyed his marriage privately. And on the morning everything collapsed, Kyle walked into the executive boardroom believing he still controlled the narrative. The room sat on the 42nd floor of Patterson Logistics headquarters overlooking Manhattan. Glass walls, steel accents, a skyline built for powerful men convincing themselves they were untouchable. Board members shuffled through merger documents while assistants poured coffee quietly. Kyle adjusted his cufflinks near the head of the table, perfectly composed in a charcoal Tom Ford suit. Confident, polished, dangerously unaware. Daniel Reeves sat 3 seats down, avoiding eye contact completely. Kyle noticed. A flicker of irritation crossed his face. Interesting. Then the doors opened again, and Paula walked in. Conversation stopped instantly. Every head in the room turned toward her. Kyle blinked once. Not dramatically, but enough. Because Paula didn't look like the woman he emotionally buried years ago. She looked calm, sharp, terrifyingly self-possessed. Black tailored suit, hair sleek against her shoulders, no visible fragility anywhere. For a brief moment, Kyle genuinely looked confused. "Paula," he said carefully. She offered a faint smile. "Good morning." Board members exchanged uncertain glances. Kyle recovered quickly, forcing a laugh. "Didn't know you were coming." Paula stepped farther into the room slowly. That's kind of the theme today. Something about the sentence shifted the air immediately. Kyle's instincts finally screamed at him now. "Danger. Real danger." He straightened slightly. "Can we talk outside?" "No." The calmness of her answer hit harder than shouting ever could. Kyle's jaw tightened. "Paula, this isn't the place." Evelyn Brooks entered behind her, and suddenly the room changed completely. Because powerful men recognized lawyers the same way prey recognized predators. Sharp navy suit, cold composure, a leather folder thick enough to ruin lives. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, like he already knew the explosion had begun. Kyle stared at Evelyn, then at Paula. "What is this?" Paula met his gaze evenly. The truth. Silence. Heavy. Electric. One board member cleared his throat awkwardly. "Kyle, what exactly is happening?" Kyle forced another smile, but it looked strained now. "My wife is clearly confused about some financial issues." Confused. There it was, the old strategy. Minimize her, discredit her, frame emotion as instability. Only this time, Paula didn't react emotionally at all. That terrified him more. Evelyn calmly placed folders in front of the board members one by one. The sound of paper sliding across polished wood felt almost ceremonial. Kyle's voice sharpened. "You had no right." "Oh, she absolutely did." Evelyn interrupted smoothly. "Nobody spoke after that." Board members opened documents carefully. Wire transfers, forgery analysis, offshore account summaries, corporate concealment records. Paula watched realization spread slowly across the room. Shock first, then confusion, then fear. A gray-haired investor looked up pale-faced. These signatures, Evelyn answered immediately, forged. Kyle stood abruptly. This is ridiculous. Paula remained seated calmly. Interesting. Even now he expected her to panic before he did. He still didn't understand who she had become. Kyle pointed aggressively toward Daniel. You gave them internal documents. Daniel swallowed hard, but finally nodded. Yes. Kyle looked genuinely betrayed. Not guilty. Betrayed. Because men like him always believed loyalty only flowed toward themselves. You're destroying this company over misunderstandings, Kyle snapped. Evelyn folded her hands neatly. No, Mr. Patterson, you destroyed your company through fraud. The room went silent again. Kyle turned toward Paula, now abandoning charm entirely. You're really doing this. Paula held his stare. For years, she would have crumbled under that tone. The disappointment, the intimidation, the implication that protecting herself was cruelty. Not anymore. You did this, she said quietly. Kyle laughed bitterly. Oh, please. After everything I gave you, there it was, the transactional mindset underneath the marriage. Love measured like investment, control mistaken for generosity. Paula tilted her head slightly. You mean the house I partially paid for? She asked softly. Or the company you used my inheritance to save a few board members visibly stiffened? Kyle looked around the room quickly now. He was losing control too fast. And narcissists panicked hardest when witnesses existed. You were depressed for years, he snapped suddenly. You weren't capable of handling financial decisions. The sentence hit the room like broken glass, because everyone heard it now. The contempt, the manipulation, the cruelty beneath the polished executive image. Paula felt strange hearing him weaponize her grief publicly. Strange because it no longer hurt the way he expected. It only exposed him further. She leaned forward slightly. You cheated on me while I was hospitalized after losing our baby. Silence. Absolute silence. Even the air conditioning suddenly sounded loud. Kyle froze. Not because he felt ashamed, because she had finally said it out loud where other people could hear. One woman on the board slowly lowered her pen. Another man removed his glasses entirely. Paula continued calmly. You spent years calling me unstable while forging my name on financial documents. Her eyes never left Kyle's face. And the entire time you thought I was too broken to notice. Kyle's composure cracked visibly for the first time. This is personal revenge. No, Evelyn corrected. This is evidence. More documents slid across the table. Daniel spoke quietly now. There are additional hidden accounts in Singapore and Zurich. One investor cursed under his breath. Another demanded immediate legal review. Everything accelerated after that. Voices overlapping, phones buzzing, board members arguing, Kyle trying desperately to regain authority. But the illusion was dying too fast, and illusions once exposed rarely survived. Then came the final moment, the moment Paula would remember for the rest of her life. Kyle turned toward her fully rage, finally overpowering charm. You think you won? He hissed quietly. Paula stood slowly. The room fell silent again, almost instinctively. Because suddenly everyone understood something. The woman Kyle spent years diminishing was the strongest person in the room now. Paula looked directly into his eyes, and for the first time in their entire marriage, she felt absolutely no fear. Only clarity, only freedom. "You thought I was too broken to fight back," she said softly. Kyle stared at her silently. Paula's voice remained calm enough to terrify him. "But while you were busy underestimating me," she whispered, "I was healing, and you were getting careless." The sentence landed harder than screaming ever could, because it was true. Kyle finally understood. This hadn't happened suddenly. Paula had been quietly rebuilding herself while he mocked her weakness, quietly collecting evidence, quietly becoming impossible to control. And now he was trapped inside consequences he never believed she was capable of creating. Then the boardroom doors opened again. Everyone turned. 2 federal agents stepped inside holding identification. One spoke calmly. Kyle Patterson. For the first time in years, Kyle Patterson looked afraid. Real fear. Raw. Human. And Paula realized something almost heartbreaking in that moment. Powerful men always think women are harmless until the women stop loving them more than they love themselves. The agent stepped forward again. "We need to ask you several questions regarding financial misconduct and fraud allegations." Kyle looked toward Paula one last time. Not loving, not apologetic, just stunned. Because the broken woman he underestimated had finally become the end of him. The internet destroyed people faster than courts ever could. By sunrise, Kyle Patterson's face was everywhere. Financial fraud allegations, federal investigation, corporate misconduct, possible spousal forgery. The headline spread across every business outlet before noon, and attached to nearly every article was the same photo: Kyle leaving the boardroom looking furious beside Paula Patterson walking calmly behind him. The contrast fascinated people. His rage, her composure. By afternoon, social media had already chosen its villain. Paula sat quietly in her Manhattan apartment watching cable news play silently across the television while Naomi scrolled through her phone beside her. "Oh my God," Naomi muttered. "TikTok is destroying him." Paula stared at the screen numbly. It still felt surreal. For years, Kyle controlled every narrative surrounding their marriage. Now strangers were dissecting his behavior publicly, frame by frame. A business anchor appeared on screen, discussing emotional abuse allegations tied to the fraud case. Paula muted the television immediately. Too much. All of it felt too loud. Naomi looked over carefully. "You okay?" Paula took a slow breath. "I don't know yet." And that was the truth. People imagined revenge felt euphoric, but mostly it felt exhausting. Because exposing someone who emotionally destroyed you also forced you to relive every moment they convinced you to stay silent. Her phone buzzed again. Unknown number. Paula stared at it for several seconds before answering. "Hello," heavy breathing. Then Kyle's voice. "What the hell have you done? No apology, no accountability, just fury." Paula leaned back slowly against the couch. "I told the truth. You humiliated me publicly." The irony nearly made her laugh. Years of humiliation inside private rooms apparently mattered less to him than one public consequence. Kyle's breathing sharpened angrily through the phone. "You think people are on your side now? They'll turn on you too." There it was again, the threat beneath the charm, the need to regain emotional control. Paula closed her eyes briefly. 4 years ago, this phone call would have shattered her. Now she simply sounded tired. "You should call your lawyer, Kyle." Silence. Then his voice dropped dangerously low. "You're enjoying this." Paula opened her eyes slowly. "No," she whispered. "I'm surviving it." And for the first time in their entire marriage, Kyle had no response. She hung up first. The silence afterward felt enormous. Naomi stared at her carefully. "You didn't even shake." Paula looked down at her hands. It was true. No trembling, no panic. Somewhere along the way, fear stopped living inside her body. By evening, the Patterson family officially entered damage control mode. Margaret released a carefully worded public statement calling the allegations deeply exaggerated, misunderstandings fueled by emotional instability during a painful marital breakdown. Paula stared at the statement online for nearly a full minute. Emotional instability, even now, even after evidence, even after fraud. Margaret still believed women became less credible once they hurt too visibly. Naomi cursed aloud from the kitchen. She's unbelievable. Paula remained strangely calm. No, she said quietly. She's consistent. That was the horrifying thing about people like Margaret. Cruelty wasn't emotional for them. It was philosophical. Protect the family, protect the image, protect the men. Women were collateral damage. Hours later, Sabrina Cole released her own statement. And unlike Margaret's, it detonated. Sabrina admitted to the affair publicly, detailed Kyle's manipulation, confirmed hidden accounts, described emotional coercion. One sentence in particular exploded online within minutes. He trained women to doubt themselves, so he never had to question himself. Paula reread the line 3 separate times. Because it was true, perfectly true. The public response turned vicious after that. Former employees came forward anonymously. Stories emerged, patterns surfaced. Kyle's empire started collapsing in real time. Investors pulled out. The board suspended him indefinitely. And suddenly powerful people who once worshipped him stopped answering his calls. Paula watched all of it quietly, not celebrating, observing. Dr. Miller warned her this part would feel emotionally confusing. When abusive people lose control publicly, he explained during therapy, victims sometimes grieve even while escaping. At first, Paula didn't understand. Then Kyle showed up outside her apartment building 3 nights later. Rain poured heavily across Manhattan streets, while Paula stepped out of a black SUV after dinner with Evelyn. And there he was, standing beneath the awning, looking exhausted. Not polished anymore, not controlled. Human. His beard had grown unevenly, dark circles shadowed beneath his eyes. For one disorienting second, Paula saw the man she originally fell in love with, and that hurt more than she expected. Kyle stepped toward her immediately. We need to talk. Evelyn moved protectively beside Paula. Kyle laughed bitterly. Jesus Christ, are you afraid I'm going to attack you now? Paula met his eyes evenly. I'm afraid you'll manipulate me. That landed harder. Kyle visibly flinched, because for years, manipulation only worked while unnamed. Once spoken aloud, it lost some power. Rain hammered loudly around them. Kyle looked exhausted suddenly. You destroyed my life. Paula stared at him quietly. No, she said softly. I stopped letting you destroy mine. The sentence cracked something in him. You think you're innocent, Kyle snapped. You disappeared after the miscarriage. You shut down emotionally. I was drowning too. Paula's chest tightened painfully. There it was. The closest thing Kyle would ever give to vulnerability. Still wrapped in blame, still centered around himself, but real enough to hurt. I begged you to grieve with me, she whispered. You abandoned me instead. Kyle rubbed both hands over his face aggressively. You made everything so heavy all the time. Paula stared at him in disbelief. Heavy. As if losing their child was an inconvenience that ruined the atmosphere. You cheated on me while I was bleeding in a hospital bed. Kyle looked away immediately. Guilt flashed across his face for the first time. Real guilt. Small. Late. But real. The sight almost broke Paula's heart. Not because she wanted him back, because she finally understood something tragic. Kyle probably did love her once, just not enough to become a better man, and love without accountability eventually turned poisonous. Rain soaked through Kyle's coat while he stepped closer again. "I never thought you'd actually leave." There it was, the truth. Not "I'm sorry," not "I was wrong," just shock that she finally chose herself. Paula felt tears threaten suddenly, not from weakness, from mourning. Mourning the years she wasted trying to earn kindness from someone who viewed loyalty as permission. Kyle's voice cracked slightly. "Paula, please." That word used to own her. Please. One soft request after cruelty. One tiny moment of tenderness strong enough to restart the entire cycle. Not anymore. Paula looked at him carefully, really looked, and suddenly he didn't seem powerful at all, just emotionally small. A man who built his confidence by convincing women they were hard to love. She stepped back slowly. "You should have been afraid of losing me before you lost me." Kyle's expression collapsed completely, and for the first time, Paula saw regret strong enough to ruin a person. Not regret for cheating, not even regret for fraud. Regret that the woman he underestimated had finally learned her worth. The doorman opened the building entrance behind her. Warm light spilled across the rain-soaked sidewalk. Kyle looked desperate now, broken almost. "Paula, please don't do this." She stared at him for one final second, then quietly answered the sentence he never expected. "I already survived it." And this time, she walked away first. Divorce court didn't look dramatic the way movies promised. No screaming. No surprise witnesses bursting through doors, just quiet destruction unfolding through paperwork testimony and truth people spent years avoiding. Paula Patterson sat beside Evelyn Brooks in a tailored ivory suit while photographers crowded outside the Manhattan courthouse like vultures waiting for blood. And for the first time in years, Paula wasn't afraid of being seen. Kyle arrived 20 minutes later surrounded by attorneys. The second cameras flashed toward him, his expression hardened automatically into the polished corporate mask that used to fool everyone. But not Paula. Not anymore. Now she could see every crack, the sleeplessness beneath his eyes, the tension in his jaw, the way arrogance kept collapsing into panic every few seconds. Power looked very different once consequences entered the room. Inside courtroom 7, the air felt cold enough to sharpen everything. The judge reviewed documents calmly while both legal teams organized files across long wooden tables. Kyle avoided looking directly at Paula at first. That hurt him more than she expected, because once upon a time he couldn't stop looking at her. Once upon a time, she had been his safest place. The thought passed through her chest quietly before disappearing again. Grief no longer controlled her the way it used to. It simply visited sometimes. Evelyn leaned closer. "You ready?" Paula nodded once. Yes, and she meant it. The proceedings began with financial evidence. Wire transfers, forgery analysis, corporate concealment. Every lie Kyle carefully buried over the years now existed in neat legal folders impossible to emotionally manipulate away. One forensic accountant explained the forged signatures in clinical detail. Another testified about hidden offshore entities. Kyle's attorneys tried reframing everything as procedural confusion, miscommunication, stress, administrative error. But facts were stubborn things, especially once patterns appeared. Then came the emotional abuse testimony, and suddenly the courtroom atmosphere changed completely, because financial crimes sounded cold, but psychological destruction felt human. Evelyn stood smoothly before the judge, Mrs. Patterson spent years financially isolated while grieving pregnancy loss. During that same period, Mr. Patterson engaged in infidelity, unauthorized asset transfers, and repeated coercive emotional manipulation. Kyle's attorney immediately objected. Speculation. Evelyn didn't even blink. We have recordings. Silence. Paula watched Kyle stiffen across the courtroom. Good. He should hear himself now the way she heard him for years. The recording from the Patterson family dinner played softly through courtroom speakers. She'd never survive without me. Kyle's voice. Clear. Confident. Controlling. A chill moved through the room instantly. Then another recording. You're too emotional. Another. You're unstable lately. Another. You make everything difficult. Paula sat perfectly still while the judge listened carefully. Years ago, those sentences destroyed her self-worth piece by piece. Today, they sounded exactly like what they truly were. Control, not love. Kyle finally looked toward her fully during the fourth recording, and for the first time, she saw shame. Real shame. Not for cheating, not even for fraud. For hearing himself exposed publicly without charm protecting him. That was the thing about manipulation. It depended heavily on privacy. Once strangers heard it objectively, the cruelty became obvious. Margaret Patterson was called later that afternoon, and somehow she managed to make everything worse. The older woman sat stiffly in the witness chair wearing pearls and expensive perfume like respectability itself. Evelyn questioned her calmly. Mrs. Patterson, did you ever blame Paula for the deterioration of the marriage following her miscarriage? Margaret sighed dramatically. I think Paula became emotionally overwhelmed. Not an answer. Classic deflection. Evelyn continued smoothly. Did you tell her she should have recovered faster? Margaret hesitated too long. We were all grieving. Paula almost laughed. No, they were all inconvenienced. She was the only one truly abandoned inside the grief. Then Evelyn asked the question that shattered Margaret's composure completely. Did you know your son was involved with another woman during Paula's hospitalization? Silence. Tiny. Deadly. Margaret's eyes flickered toward Kyle instinctively, and that alone answered everything. The courtroom noticed too. Evelyn stepped back slightly. No further questions. Kyle looked furious afterward. Not at the betrayal itself, at losing control over the image. Richard Patterson testified the following morning. Unlike Margaret, he looked exhausted. Older suddenly. Smaller. Money problems aged powerful men quickly. When questioned about Paula's inheritance contributions to the company, Richard finally admitted the truth publicly. Yes, he muttered. Without her trust fund support, Patterson Logistics likely would have collapsed during expansion. A wave of whispers moved across the courtroom gallery. Kyle closed his eyes briefly. Paula simply sat quietly, because validation felt strangely empty after years of being denied basic dignity. Still, hearing the truth aloud mattered. The most difficult moment came when Paula herself took the stand. Her hands trembled slightly while being sworn in. Not from fear, from memory. The courtroom looked enormous from the witness chair. Cold wood, bright lighting, strangers watching. Kyle stared at her with an expression she couldn't fully read anymore. Maybe regret, maybe disbelief, maybe both. Evelyn's voice softened carefully. Mrs. Patterson, can you describe how your marriage changed after the miscarriage? The question cracked something open inside her chest immediately. Paula inhaled slowly. At first she whispered, I thought grief was making us distant. The courtroom remained completely silent. But eventually I realized grief wasn't the problem. Evelyn nodded gently. What was Paula looked directly at Kyle then? Not angrily, honestly. He stopped seeing my pain as human. Kyle's jaw tightened visibly. Paula continued anyway. He treated sadness like failure, like weakness. Her voice shook slightly now, and after a while, I started apologizing for hurting. Even the judge looked affected by that. Because emotional abuse sounded different when survivors stopped minimizing it. Paula swallowed hard. I spent years believing I was difficult to love. Kyle stared downward now, unable to meet her eyes. Interesting. That hurt him. Not accusations, not evidence. Truth. Evelyn asked one final question. Mrs. Patterson. What finally changed Paula sat quietly for several seconds, then answered with absolute clarity. I realized love shouldn't require disappearing. The silence afterward felt sacred somehow. Not dramatic, just true. When court recessed later that afternoon, Kyle caught up with Paula outside the courthouse hallway. Paula. She stopped walking slowly. Kyle looked exhausted beyond words now. No cameras nearby, no audience, just two people standing inside the ruins of what used to be a marriage. You really think I'm some monster? He asked quietly. Paula looked at him carefully, and suddenly she understood something tragic. Kyle genuinely never believed emotional neglect counted as cruelty because he only recognized damage he could physically see. That's the saddest part, she whispered. You hurt people without even noticing you're doing it. The sentence hit him harder than anger ever could. Kyle's eyes reddened slightly. For a second, he looked terrifyingly human again. I loved you. Paula's chest tightened painfully. I know, and none of this matters to you now. She looked at him for a very long time, then answered honestly, It mattered enough to almost destroy me. Kyle visibly broke at that. Finally. Not because he lost money, not because of public humiliation, because for the first time he fully understood the emotional cost of being loved by him. And deep down, he knew Paula deserved better long before she finally realized it herself. The divorce finalized on a gray Thursday afternoon in October. No dramatic celebration followed. No champagne, no victorious music swelling in the background like movies promised. Just silence. Heavy, exhausted, final. Paula Patterson stood outside the courthouse while cold wind twisted through Manhattan streets, lifting strands of hair across her face. Married for 11 years. Destroyed in less than one. Strange how quickly entire lives could collapse once truth entered the room. Evelyn squeezed her shoulder gently before leaving for another meeting. You did well. Paula gave a faint smile. It still felt strange hearing people describe survival like strength. After everyone disappeared, Paula remained alone on the courthouse steps for several minutes, staring at traffic. She expected relief to feel louder. Instead, it arrived quietly, like finally setting down something impossibly heavy after carrying it too long. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number, but she already knew. Kyle. Paula stared at the screen for a long moment before answering. What his voice sounded rough. Can we talk? Every instinct told her no. Dr. Miller would have recommended no. Naomi definitely would have recommended no. But another part of Paula understood something important. Closure rarely arrived through perfect decisions. Sometimes people just needed one final look at the ruins to fully leave them behind. Where the old house, her chest tightened instantly. The house, the giant Connecticut mansion where she lost herself room by room, Paula almost refused, then quietly said 1 hour. Kyle's voice cracked slightly. Thank you. The drive there felt surreal. Autumn leaves blurred gold and red outside the car windows while old memories surfaced against her will. Paula laughing barefoot in the kitchen years ago, Kyle dancing with her during a power outage, late night pizza on the floor before the company became successful. They weren't always miserable. That was the hardest part. Toxic love rarely began toxic. The house looked emptier somehow when Paula arrived. Colder. Like even the walls understood the marriage was dead now. Kyle opened the door before she could knock. For a second, neither of them spoke. He looked older. Not physically, emotionally. Like consequences had finally reached places ego used to protect. The expensive confidence was gone now. No tailored perfection. No polished charm. Just a tired man standing inside the wreckage of his own choices. "You changed the security code," he said quietly. Paula stepped inside slowly. "It's not my home anymore." The sentence landed between them heavily. Kyle nodded once, like he deserved that. The silence inside the house felt haunting. No staff tonight, no music, no television noise, just two former lovers standing inside memories neither knew how to survive. Kyle gestured toward that living room awkwardly. Paula remained standing. "I don't want coffee." A sad smile crossed his face briefly. "You still know exactly what I was going to offer." Of course she did. You didn't spend 11 years loving someone without memorizing their instincts. Kyle shoved his hands into his pockets. "I don't even know where to start." Paula looked around the room slowly, maybe with honesty, since we skipped that part during the marriage. The sentence cut cleanly. Kyle absorbed it without defense this time. Interesting. He wasn't fighting anymore. That changed the atmosphere completely. For years, every conversation between them felt like emotional warfare. Now exhaustion had replaced control. Kyle finally sat down heavily on the couch. "I keep replaying everything." Paula leaned lightly against the fireplace, and his eyes lifted toward hers, "and I don't recognize myself in half of it." There it was. The beginning of accountability. Not enough to undo damage, but real enough to hurt. Paula crossed her arms quietly. "You only recognize yourself when you're winning." Kyle looked down immediately, because that was true too. Silence settled again, then Kyle spoke so softly she almost didn't hear him. "I miss you." Paula's chest tightened painfully despite herself. Not because she wanted him back, because some wounds never fully stopped aching. Which version, she asked quietly. Kyle frowned slightly. "What you don't miss who I became," Paula whispered. "You miss the woman who kept forgiving you." The truth of that visibly shook him. Kyle rubbed both hands over his face. "That's not fair." Paula almost laughed sadly. "Neither was grieving alone while my husband slept with someone else." He flinched hard. Good. Some truths deserved sharp edges. Kyle stood suddenly and walked toward the massive windows overlooking the dark backyard. "I know I ruined everything." Paula studied him carefully. This was the closest he had ever come to full responsibility. No excuses yet, no blame, just damage. "I used to think if I loved you hard enough," she said softly, "you'd eventually stop hurting me." Kyle closed his eyes. Paula continued anyway, "But you only stopped when consequences arrived." The room went painfully still, because they both knew it was true. Kyle turned toward her slowly. "You think I never loved you?" The question sounded almost childlike, like he genuinely needed the answer. Paula looked at him for a very long time, then answered honestly, "I think you loved me the way emotionally selfish people love." Her voice remained calm. "Deeply when it benefited you, poorly when it required sacrifice." Kyle's eyes reddened instantly. For years, Paula dreamed about him finally understanding her pain. Now that moment sat directly in front of her. And strangely, it didn't feel triumphant, just sad. Kyle laughed weakly through obvious emotion. You know what destroys me? Paula said nothing. I really thought you'd never leave. There it was again. The core truth beneath everything. Kyle never believed Paula valued herself enough to walk away, because he spent years training her not to. Paula felt tears burn behind her eyes suddenly, not from weakness, from mourning the woman she used to be, the woman who accepted emotional starvation because she confused endurance with love. Kyle stepped closer slowly. I keep thinking about who we were before all this. Paula's voice cracked slightly. She died trying to love you. Silence. Absolute silence. The sentence shattered something visible inside him. Kyle looked like he'd been physically struck, because finally, he understood the real cost of what he did. Not the money, not the scandal, not the divorce. Her. The slow death of the woman who once adored him completely. Kyle's breathing turned uneven. I would do anything to fix it. Paula shook her head gently. That's the problem. Tears filled her eyes now. You would do anything except change before it was too late. He broke then. Not dramatically, not violently, just quietly. A man collapsing under the unbearable weight of realizing love was offered to him fully once, and he treated it like something endlessly replaceable. Paula watched him carefully, and to her own surprise, she no longer hated him. Hate required emotional attachment. What she felt now was distance. Distance and grief for two people who destroyed each other in different ways. Kyle looked at her desperately one final time. Did you ever love me again after you found out? The question hung between them like broken glass. Paula stared at him silently, because the answer was complicated. Part of her kept loving him long after betrayal, long after humiliation, long after emotional abandonment. That was the tragedy of loving someone manipulative. Love survived places self-respect shouldn't have. But Paula no longer needed him to understand that. She simply picked up her coat and walked toward the front door. Kyle's voice cracked behind her. Paula. She paused briefly, then without turning around, she left him alone inside the empty house he once believed mattered more than the woman who made it feel alive. The first night Paula Patterson slept in her new Manhattan apartment, she cried because of the silence. Not painful silence, safe silence. No tension humming beneath walls, no waiting for Kyle's mood to determine whether the evening would feel peaceful or unbearable. No rehearsing conversations in her head before speaking, just stillness. And after years inside emotional chaos, stillness felt almost unfamiliar. Paula stood barefoot in front of the massive windows overlooking the city while rain softened the skyline into silver light. The apartment wasn't enormous by billionaire standards, but it was hers. Every piece of furniture, every framed photograph, every decision. That mattered more than luxury ever could. Naomi helped decorate the space over several weekends. Warm, neutral colors, bookshelves everywhere, fresh flowers constantly filling the kitchen island because Paula once admitted Kyle hated clutter. Now tulips sat in every room simply because she liked them. Healing sometimes looked embarrassingly small at first. Buying flowers, sleeping diagonally across the bed, listening to music without headphones because nobody complained anymore. Paula started rediscovering herself through tiny freedoms, and those freedoms slowly became a life. Her consulting career exploded faster than expected, partly because scandal made her name recognizable, but mostly because Paula was genuinely brilliant. That truth took time to accept. For years, Kyle reduced her intelligence to supportive wife utility. Now companies actively pursued her strategic work. One afternoon after finishing a presentation for a luxury fashion brand, Paula remained alone inside the conference room staring at her reflection in the dark glass wall. Confident posture, clear voice, steady eyes. She looked like the woman she used to be before grief and manipulation hollowed her out. Except stronger now, because rebuilt things carried wisdom original versions never had. You know what's weird? Naomi asked during dinner later that week. What you laugh louder now? Paula blinked softly, then realized Naomi was right. Kyle hated loud emotion unless it centered him. Over time, Paula unconsciously made herself quieter in every possible way. Smaller laugh, smaller opinions, smaller existence. Now, joy escaped her naturally again sometimes. And every time it did, she felt another invisible chain break. The foundation idea came unexpectedly. Paula was speaking privately at a women's recovery event in Brooklyn when a young woman approached her afterward, trembling with tears. "My husband says I'm impossible to love," she whispered. The sentence punched straight through Paula's chest, because once upon a time she believed that too. The woman continued crying softly. "I watched your interview last month and—" Her voice cracked. "You sounded like someone who survived what I'm living through." Paula hugged her without thinking and suddenly understood something important. Healing became heavier when kept only for yourself, but shared healing transformed into purpose. 3 months later, the Patterson Foundation officially launched. Not under Kyle's name, under hers. A support organization helping women rebuild after emotional abuse, financial dependency, and coercive relationships. Therapy funding, career rebuilding, emergency housing support, legal assistance partnerships. Paula poured herself into the work with almost frightening intensity. Not because she wanted to stay trapped in pain, because she knew exactly how terrifying freedom felt when you'd spent years being convinced you couldn't survive alone. One rainy afternoon, Sabrina Cole quietly attended a support workshop. Paula spotted her immediately across the room. For a moment, neither woman moved. The history between them still existed. The betrayal, the guilt, the shared damage Kyle left behind. Then Sabrina walked over slowly. "You built all this?" she asked softly. Paula nodded. Sabrina looked around the room with visible emotion. "There are so many women here." "There always were," Paula replied quietly. "Most of us were just suffering silently." Sabrina's eyes filled with tears. "I still hate what I did to you." Paula considered that honestly, then shook her head gently. "Kyle wanted us competing instead of comparing experiences." Sabrina laughed weakly through tears. "That sounds exactly like him." Paula smiled faintly. Yes. The strange thing was, talking about Kyle no longer shattered her. His name had become part of her history instead of the center of her emotional world. That was real healing, not forgetting, just no longer bleeding every time memory touched you. The invitation arrived in early spring. National Women's Leadership Conference. Keynote speaker request. Naomi screamed so loudly reading the email that Paula nearly dropped her coffee. "Oh my God," Naomi shouted. "Do you understand how huge this is?" Paula stared at the screen, stunned. The invitation described her as an advocate for emotional recovery, financial empowerment, and personal rebuilding after trauma. For several seconds, she couldn't breathe properly, because nobody described her as broken anymore, only rebuilt. That night, Paula stood alone on her apartment balcony overlooking Manhattan lights, while cold wind lifted her hair gently. Her phone buzzed unexpectedly. Unknown number. For a split second, old anxiety returned automatically. Then she answered calmly, "Hello, silence." Then Kyle's voice, soft, unsteady. Congratulations. Paula closed her eyes briefly. Months had passed since their last conversation, months since the divorce finalized, months since she stopped measuring her worth through his attention. What do you want, Kyle? Nothing manipulative entered his voice this time. Just sadness. I saw the article about your foundation. Paula remained quiet. Kyle exhaled softly through the phone. You look happy. The sentence hurt unexpectedly, not because she missed him, because happiness used to feel impossible inside their marriage. I'm peaceful, she corrected quietly. Silence stretched between them. Then Kyle whispered something that would have healed her years ago. I'm sorry. Paula leaned against the balcony railing slowly. The city glowed endlessly beneath her. Taxis, music, life continuing everywhere. And suddenly she understood something beautiful. Closure didn't come from apologies. It came from no longer needing them. Kyle's voice cracked slightly. I should have loved you better. Tears burned Paula's eyes instantly, not because she wanted him back, because part of her would always mourn the life they could have had if he'd chosen growth instead of control. But mourning wasn't the same as returning. Paula looked out across Manhattan quietly. I know, Kyle cried softly on the other end of the line. Really cried. No manipulation, no performance. Just grief arriving too late. And for the first time in years, Paula felt compassion for him without sacrificing herself to save him. That was freedom too. Kyle finally whispered, I hope someone loves you the way you deserved. Paula closed her eyes against sudden tears, then answered honestly, they already do. Not a man, not romance, life, friends, purpose, herself. The call ended gently after that. No screaming, no destruction, just two people finally accepting the truth too late to repair it. Weeks later, Paula stood backstage at the national conference listening to thousands of women filling the auditorium beyond the curtains. Her heartbeat thundered softly in her chest. A stage assistant smiled nervously. They're ready for you. Paula inhaled slowly, then stepped toward the light. The auditorium lights were so bright, Paula Patterson couldn't fully see the audience at first. Only shapes. Thousands of women seated in darkness beyond the stage, waiting, listening, hurting in ways strangers rarely noticed. For one brief second, fear returned unexpectedly. Not fear of public speaking, fear of being fully seen. Because for years, survival required hiding pain, hiding humiliation, hiding the slow emotional destruction happening behind expensive walls. Now she stood center stage with nowhere left to disappear. The applause softened as Paula stepped toward the microphone. Her pulse thundered steadily inside her chest. Then silence settled across the room, and suddenly she remembered the woman she used to be. The woman crying quietly in bathrooms so her husband wouldn't get irritated. The woman apologizing for grief. The woman convinced love meant enduring emotional starvation gracefully. Paula looked out toward the audience carefully, then finally spoke. 4 years ago, she said softly, my husband told people I was too broken to fight back. The room became perfectly still. Paula smiled faintly. At the time, she continued, I believed him. Pain flickered across countless faces in the audience instantly. Recognition. That was the terrifying thing about emotional abuse. It sounded personal until survivors started comparing notes. Paula rested both hands lightly against the podium. I thought being kind meant being patient with cruelty. Her voice remained calm but emotional. I thought loyalty meant enduring things silently. She swallowed carefully. And I thought love meant shrinking myself enough to make someone else comfortable. The silence in the auditorium deepened. Some women already cried quietly. Paula noticed because she used to cry exactly like that too, trying not to inconvenience anyone with pain. She continued slowly, "My marriage didn't collapse in one moment. It disappeared in pieces." Images flashed through her mind while speaking. The hospital room, the loneliness, Kyle's cold voice, the endless apologies. "I lost myself gradually," she whispered. "That's what emotional manipulation does. It teaches you to abandon yourself before anyone else has to." A woman near the front row wiped tears from her face openly now. Paula's own throat tightened. For years, she feared speaking publicly about what happened because she worried people would think she sounded weak. Now she understood honesty required far more courage than silence ever did. She stepped away from the podium slightly. "You know the hardest part?" she asked softly. "He never hit me." The room remained breathlessly quiet. "So every time I hurt, I convinced myself I was overreacting." Paula gave a sad smile. "Because bruises would have been easier to explain than disappearing emotionally." Several women nodded immediately. Recognition again. God, there were so many of them. Paula felt emotion rise hard into her chest. Not grief anymore. Purpose. "I spent years trying to become lovable enough for someone emotionally incapable of protecting my heart." Her voice cracked slightly then, but this time she didn't apologize for it. The audience applauded softly at that. Paula smiled through sudden tears. Healing still felt strange sometimes, especially publicly. She looked toward the back of the auditorium absent-mindedly and froze. Kyle sat alone in the final row. Dark suit, tired eyes, stillness. For a split second, time folded backward painfully. The old house, the old marriage, the old version of herself who would have searched his face desperately for approval. But that woman no longer existed. Kyle looked smaller somehow now, not pathetic, just human. Human in the way powerful men become once someone finally survives them. Paula held his gaze only briefly before continuing, because this story no longer belonged to him, it belonged to her. "I used to think healing meant becoming who I was before the pain." She shook her head slowly, "But healing actually means becoming someone new. Someone who no longer betrays themselves to keep other people comfortable." The applause grew louder. Paula's confidence settled deeper with every word now. Not performative confidence, earned confidence. The kind rebuilt painfully after emotional destruction. "I didn't heal because my ex-husband apologized," she continued. "I healed because one day I finally believed my pain mattered." A woman shouted yes from somewhere near the middle rows. Laughter broke softly through the room, warm, alive. Paula laughed too, and suddenly she realized something incredible. She wasn't speaking from survival anymore. She was speaking from freedom. Tears filled her eyes again as she looked across the audience. "If you're sitting here tonight, wondering whether you're difficult to love..." The room went silent immediately. Paula's voice softened almost into a whisper. "You are not difficult to love." Her eyes shined now. "You are difficult to manipulate once you remember your worth." The auditorium erupted into applause. Women stood, some crying openly, some hugging each other. Paula placed one trembling hand against her chest, overwhelmed completely now. Because this was the revenge she never imagined while crying alone in the dark years ago. Not Kyle's downfall, not public humiliation. This, helping other women feel less alone, helping them return to themselves faster than she did. The applause slowly softened again. Paula took one final breath, then gave the sentence that would spread across social media within hours. "He thought I was too broken to fight back." "Fight back," she said quietly. What he never understood was, Broken women learn how to rebuild sharper. The audience exploded to its feet, standing ovation, thunderous applause crashing through the auditorium like a wave. Paula closed her eyes briefly against the emotion of it all. Not because strangers were cheering, because years ago she genuinely believed her life was over, and now she stood here whole, not untouched, not unscarred, but whole. When the event finally ended nearly an hour later, Paula exited through a private backstage hallway overlooking the city. The night air felt cool against her skin. Manhattan glittered endlessly below. A staff assistant hurried toward her, smiling. "Your speech is already going viral." Paula laughed softly through exhaustion. Terrifying. It was beautiful. The assistant walked away after that, leaving Paula alone beside the giant glass windows. Footsteps sounded quietly behind her. Kyle. Of course. Paula turned slowly. For several seconds neither spoke. Then Kyle smiled sadly. "You were always the strongest person in the room," he said quietly. "I just benefited from you not knowing it. The sentence hurt beautifully because it was true." Paula looked at him carefully one final time. No hatred remained anymore. No desperate love either. Just history. Kyle glanced toward the city lights. "You look free." Paula smiled softly. "I am." And for the first time, she truly meant it. Kyle nodded once, like a man finally accepting a door would never reopen. Then he walked away quietly into the shadows of the hallway. Paula watched him disappear. Not longing, not grieving, just grateful she survived long enough to meet the woman she became afterward. Then she turned back toward the city. Morning sunlight slowly began rising between the buildings, gold spilling across glass towers. New day, new life. And Paula Patterson smiled into the light, like someone no longer afraid of her own future. Some people think heartbreak destroys you all at once, but the truth is the most dangerous kind of pain happens slowly. It happens when someone convinces you that your feelings are too much, when you start apologizing for your sadness, when you become smaller just to keep the peace. And one day you wake up realizing you abandoned yourself trying to save a relationship that was never trying to save you back. Paula's story is not just about betrayal. It's about what happens when a woman finally understands that kindness and weakness are not the same thing. Loving deeply is not foolish. Being loyal is not embarrassing. The real tragedy is staying in places where your love is only valued for how much of yourself you are willing to sacrifice. Sometimes healing doesn't look beautiful at first. Sometimes it looks lonely, quiet, confusing. Sometimes healing means grieving the version of yourself that tolerated things your future self would never accept again. But that's the powerful part of rebuilding. You stop needing permission to exist fully. The people who manipulate others often believe they will never face consequences. They mistake silence for surrender. They mistake patience for dependency. But silence can be preparation, and healing can become power. In the end, Paula didn't truly win because Kyle lost everything. She won because she found herself again, because she stopped measuring her worth through someone incapable of loving her correctly, because she finally understood that peace is more valuable than staying loyal to pain. If this story touched something in you, let it remind you of this: you are not difficult to love. You are not too emotional, and you should never have to disappear just to keep someone else comfortable. If you've ever had to rebuild yourself after betrayal, heartbreak, or emotional manipulation, share your story or feelings in the comments. Someone reading them may realize they're not alone tonight. And if you want more emotional stories about healing, strength, betrayal, and self-worth, don't forget to subscribe and stay with us for the next journey.